All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Paul Austin here with me on the show. Paul is an author, psychedelic facilitator, microdosing expert, and founder of Third Wave, a trusted research-based psychedelics education and community platform. Hey, Paul, welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, Brandon, it's good to be on this side of the mic. I had a
Yeah.
really great conversation with you for our podcast, the Psychedelic podcast, and I was thrilled to be able to come on and chat with you here today.
Yeah, likewise. It's always fun to get to do the the mic swap, uh, as you said, and yeah, just and of course we both have similar interests, which is nice. Obviously, what you do is so needed, and it's yeah, there's so much good stuff even currently. I mean, we were just talking before we turned the microphone on about some of the very latest studies and what they're showing, and we'll dig into that. It's all very exciting stuff. But what I'd like to do to kick it off is begin with my cliche opening question, which is this: You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You got 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
So,
Laughing. Good passion, actually. It's probably the best passion.
I know you edit this, so I know in reality I got a little bit of time, hopefully.
Yeah, right,
Think,
right.
no, I think if I have 10 floors, and let's say it's a slower elevator, right? Like we got a 30-second pitch. I would say, my passion is really helping people to wake up to the truth of who they are through psychedelics and plant medicine. That when we work with these substances in intentional and safe containers, that they are often not only healing but transformative. And that I feel like my purpose and my mission is to help to educate the world about the benefits of psychedelic substances.
Yeah. Yes, indeed, my friend. That is a good passion, and I'd love to hear. Yeah, I always like to start off with hearing whatever is relevant about my guest backstory,
Yeah.
just to give some context to how you got on this path.
Yeah. So I feel like we had somewhat similar upbringings. I was raised in a Christian home in West Michigan,
Hmm.
so Midwest, Grand Rapids. My parents were both progressive, so it wasn't like fundamentalist or overly conservative necessarily, but definitely traditional values.
Hmm.
As an example, I could never spend the night at a friend's house on a Saturday night. We were always up by 8 a.m. on a Sunday to go to church at 9:30, right? And that
I
was the
know,
rule
I know that.
for
I remember that drill.
for for my entire
Similar.
for my entire childhood. But I was always a little bit more of an independent and rebellious kid. Imagine
Hmm.
that. And so at the age of 16, my best friend in high school was like, I think we should smoke some weed and see what it's like. So a few days after I got my license, I'm 16, drive my car out, we smoke a blunt and have just this really great time with cannabis. And I did it a couple more times, and then sooner or later my parents found out that I had been smoking weed. And so they sit me down one Sunday after church. It's like mid-October. It's rainy. It's starting to become quite cold in Michigan. I remember the weather. And my dad looks at me and says, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 25 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and at that point in time that, I'm like, I start to sob, it hits me like a ton of bricks. I leave. I'm super angry. I'm super sad. I'm super, emotionally overwhelmed. Go and walk around, come back, and, I'm grounded for the next 2 months, basically, because I had smoked weed.
Yeah.
And what that taught me was, first of all, like as I was able to reflect on it, that there were going to be parts of my childhood and existence that I would have to simply hide from my parents because they would not be okay or accepting of it.
Yeah.
And my parents are great. They're very loving. They were the type of parents who like they were at every single soccer game. You know, they
Hmm.
enrolled me to play violin. They always pushed me to do well in school. Right, very supportive, very loving. But also, they grew up in the Just Say No era. They grew up in the Nancy Reagan era. You know, they were
Yeah.
conditioned to believe that all illegal drugs are bad.
Yeah.
And so that really set me down a path then of trying to understand and explore like what is like because I didn't buy it. I'm like I still smoked weed from time to time, 16, 17. I mean, by the time I was 19, I started to do LSD at pretty high doses and had very transformative experiences. And so I always felt like I was in the right to some degree, that I was on this path of exploration. And interestingly enough, you know, the story comes full circle. About 4 years ago, Michael Pollan's book was published, How to Change Your Mind.
Hmm.
And my dad and I have a thing where I send him a book to read. He'll read it. He sends me a book to read. I'll read it, and we, you know, have some
No, that's
discussion and
cool.
dialogue. Yeah.
I
So
like that.
I sent him Michael Pollan's book, and he read it, and he's like, "Okay, like I get it. I can see now what you're talking about, the science that backs it, how incredible psychedelic medicine can be." So he started to microdose. And my
Hmm.
dad is someone who he's never smoked weed. He's never been drunk in his life. You know, he's like a teetotaler to the max.
Hmm.
But he started to microdose, had, you know, noticed that it was helping a little bit. And then a few months after that, I was home at my parents' house in Michigan, and I guided my dad through a high dose psilocybin journey. And so he went from, you know, at the age of when I was 16, being like, this is the most disappointed I've ever been, basically, to just 15 years later, having his first ever high dose psilocybin experience, which was very impactful and transformative for him. And I feel like that's sort of like a microcosm, an anecdote of where culture is generally when it comes to these substances, that
Right.
they're really going through this destigmatization and resurgence, and people who
Totally.
you never would imagine would ever work with psychedelics or cannabis are now becoming open to it because the benefits are, especially I think with psilocybin and ayahuasca and some of these psychedelics, the benefits are
Yeah.
so significant that we
Yep.
can't look the other way anymore.
Yeah. Wow. Our stories are so similar. Super conservative Christian upbringing. I think we talked about this some on your show too. And up until recently, getting my father, I've never seen my father drink, smoke, very conservative Christian. I was the black sheep,
Yeah.
same experimenting about the same age as you. And getting him to take high dose of psilocybin. And the funny thing with him though, and I probably told you this, he is so kind of thick and in a fear-based narrative around God and Christianity, and it's like he's open to doing it. And but I gave him, what did I give him? Did I give him 4 grams, 3 grams, 3.5 grams, twice, and he says he didn't feel anything. I mean, he certainly didn't have, like, he masked whatever he felt. And I don't know if it's just like so much blocked energy. However, he microdosed for a while, and I think it has provided some benefit. I also gave him a little ketamine and
Oh, nice.
MDA, sassafras, and those seem to kind of get through too. And you know, so and but yeah, it's wild, and it's like I said, our stories are very similar. Besides, he didn't have the profound experience, but at the same time, it sort of, he was dealing with some depression related stuff for the first time in 30 years. He had it when he
Mm,
was younger, and then it kind of came back, and this, now he's doing better having taken these substances. So I don't know if he's going to give credit where credit is due, or if it is due, but yeah, it's I think there's a lot of people who are looking at these sorts of things. And my nephew, my sister's son, very conservative as well. And they, very sheltered, and he was diagnosed with Asperger's,
mm,
um, and was always kind of coddled by my mother, his grandmother, and my sister, and never really did anything. He did a couple grams, and now he's microdosing, and he said it has changed his life.
yeah.
He always has felt a burning in his head, is the way he describes it, and it quick to, like, agitation and this burning feeling, and it only goes away when he microdoses psilocybin.
Wow.
And yeah, so it is really cool to see, in both cases in my personal family, just much like yourself. So is your father is now microdosing regularly, and
I would say here and there, like he calls
yep.
them his, like sometimes with psilocybin, sometimes with LSD, he calls them his magic drops.
Uh-huh, I love
And
that.
he's in his later 60s now, very healthy, takes good care of
Hmm.
himself, but
Hmm.
definitely, as especially until longevity medicine really hits its stride, adults get into their 60s and 70s, cognitive function starts to slow down and memory
Yep.
starts to go. And so I just encourage him, at some point, like we'll probably go drink ayahuasca. He said I'm open to it. Like I'll
Cool.
potentially do it. And so I think in that, having that close father son relationship, I think is so healing in and of itself, just to have that connection and that
Totally.
relationship. And the fact that my dad was open to it and interested in
Yep.
it, I think says a lot, even about my own work and your own work, right? When we walk
Yep.
that path ourselves. And for anyone listening out there, I know there are a lot of people who are like, oh, I just wish my mom would do it. I just wish my dad would do it. I just wish my, partner would do it. And I think so much, it just like starts from within. When we're at a certain vibration and a certain frequency, people naturally are like, something has changed. What is it? And they become that much more open because they see it with their very eyes, the transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is. I mean, like you said, people that I hear these stories a lot, I would have never guessed. And now you have so much good research coming out. You have so much, it's no longer looked at as like this is for, lunatic drug addicts. It's like, oh, hold on. The thing that's lunacy is alcohol. If you want to talk about the worst drug ever that's been pushed on all of us, that literally destroys everything. What does psilocybin do? Oh, it creates new, connections, brain cell health and growth. And, it's like incredible. It's an incredible, and obviously, like anything, there's, especially if you take higher doses, you know, someone who's maybe ungrounded, it's not like there's no risk with it, with everything there is. But that's a beautiful thing about microdosing, though. I think, I've been taking, I've talked about it. I might even mention on your show. My friend makes microdoses, a company called The Great Mother, and we've been telling people on the show for a while. And they're they're wonderful because it's a small dose, but it's mixed with lion's mane and bacopa
Mm-hmm.
and cortisol, all these other things to enhance. And that's the thing that my father has continued daily. He does microdosing some, but lion's mane has really helped him. So mixing them together, even, it's like you get into a whole nother level of, all the research that's showing that it does for cognition and brain
Right.
function. And it's an incredible new world that we're in, where this stuff is now getting the respect that it's due.
Well, and I think that research is so exciting. We what a lot of people don't know is, the name of my company is Third Wave, meaning we're in this third wave of psychedelics. The first wave was the ancient and indigenous use of plant medicines. The second wave was the counterculture. And in the second wave in the 1950s, there were over 1,000 clinical papers published on the efficacy of LSD to treat alcoholism, anxiety, depression, autism, end of life anxiety, right? And then all of that research got shut down.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, specific about microdosing is a fairly new modality. A lot of people didn't start doing it until 2015, 2016,
Yeah.
2017. So we're still gathering a lot of the anecdotes and early data on it. But I mean, the data on high doses is sort of, it's unquestionably great,
Yep.
for PTSD, depression, addiction, alcoholism. MDMA is on the verge of FDA approval.
Yep.
Psilocybin is now legal in Colorado and Oregon. But when it comes to microdosing, because it's so new and so much of the red tape around it, we're still learning quite a bit. And I think the core mechanism to pay attention to is how microdosing creates something called BDNF, brain derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is so much different than the classic SSRIs like Prozac or Zoloft. Prozac or Zoloft are just, they're like repressing the difficult feelings or the emotions, and they're putting them under the surface. They're
Yeah.
sort of numbing you out, if you
Yep.
will,
Yep.
which, like, again, to be fair and balanced, can sometimes be helpful in the short
Has a
term.
time and a place. Yeah. Right.
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 If someone is really struggling, the challenge is you then become addicted to them and you can never get off of them because the withdrawal symptoms are so difficult. Whereas with microdosing, there's no withdrawal symptoms. You can start microdosing 2 or 3 times a week for a period of a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, and you can stop the next day and you'll have no withdrawal symptoms.
You're right.
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 And what's happening is, um, because of that production of BDNF, people are noticing that, oh, I can, commit to meditating a little bit more often. I'm making better lifestyle decisions about the way that I eat or the way that I move. I'm more aware and mindful of how I treat, my partner or my spouse. So microdosing, just like meditation, opens up this sort of window of being responsive. So often we're just reacting. And when we
Yep.
start to microdose, we notice, oh, I have a little bit of space, and I can
Yep.
actually choose how I want to respond to this situation or that situation to be more
Yep.
intentional
Yep.
about that. And when we do that often enough, then we start to actually change the way that we interact with reality. And when we change
You
the way that we
rewire the neural pathways in your brain, right? And
exactly.
now it becomes like, oh, this is the well-trodden path that I take versus this reactive, uh, you know, for me, anyone listening to this podcast knows I've said it forever. It's been my biggest growth edge is reactivity and agitation and so, yeah. Anyway, so didn't mean to cut you off there.
No. And so and what we emphasize, we train coaches and facilitators and how to work with microdosing and psychedelics. And what we always emphasize to our coaches is, like, when you're starting to work with this with clients, whether they have depression or addiction, or whether they're just looking for more productivity flow, it's really important to emphasize that microdosing is not this magic pill that's going to fix everything, right? We've also been so conditioned, especially in America, like, if I take this pill or this supplement or that thing, like, I'm going to be fixed, I'm going to be transformed, everything's going to be better. And it's way more complex than that. And the truth is, because of the impact that microdosing has on neuroplasticity, it acts as a catalyst. It creates that window of neuroplasticity, but you still have to commit to the change. You still have to show up. You still have to meditate. You still have to make that choice and make that decision.
Yeah.
Microdosing is just sort of greasing the wheels, if you will. It's making it a little bit easier. And so people are coming to microdoses for a range of intentions, whether it's, again, to get off Prozac and Zoloft or ADHD medication, or simply to, kind of like the Silicon Valley biohacker ethos, to be more productive, to spend more time in flow.
Yeah.
I started microdosing myself because I have pretty bad social anxiety, or at least I used to. And alcohol was just the drug that I used to manage my social anxiety. And I started microdosing with LSD, and I was like, oh, I can still be extroverted, I can still be open, but I don't have this massively bad hangover, and I'm not
Right.
poisoning my liver,
Right.
as a result of it. So it just seemed like, for me, a no-brainer. Like, humans, the one of the truths about being a human is, like, we love drugs or medicine, however you want to, we love altering our consciousness. And so
Yes.
I've always been of the approach, better to alter our consciousness with psilocybin, which, as you mentioned before, has proved to have a litany of benefits compared to alcohol or tobacco or amphetamines or all of these other quote unquote legal substances that
Yeah.
really are just lowering our consciousness. They're killing our frequencies. They're making us addicted and sick and, like, poisoned. I think psilocybin is the medicine of the people, and that
Yeah.
microdosing is the modality through which to communicate it. And that's why I'm like, in a world that is seemingly falling apart, it's like psilocybin and psychedelics are offering this, I think, significant um, opportunity to redeem ourselves as a culture.
Yeah. Well said. It's yeah, it's really interesting too, looking at psilocybin, coming from the mushroom, and uh, it's. I saw something recently that we are more closely related to mushrooms than mushrooms are to plants.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen this? And that's a really interesting thing. So it's like, you know, it's this mushrooms are these fascinating living beings that we're closely related to in some way. So it makes sense that we have this predisposition to, you know, it's like a, you know, puzzle piece that goes together in a way that the sum is greater than the equal parts, you know, in the right context and everything. And that's an interesting way to think about it.
And mushrooms always show up in distressed landscapes, right?
Ah,
So whenever psilocybin mushrooms are growing in like a forest or a wooded part, or they're growing in cow pastures, or they're growing on wood chips and construction sites, or they may be growing in the Amazon over to do microremediation over oil spills, mushrooms are always showing up to transform
mm,
toxicity,
interesting.
pollution, death into life. And so I think it's no coincidence that at a time where we're ecologically distressed, we're mentally distressed, we're existentially distressed, right? Psilocybin is making this comeback because it's showing up at a place in time where it's so clear that we, not only as a human species, but as a global species, we need help.
Yeah.
And mushrooms help in so
Yeah.
many ways.
Wow. Yeah. I've never heard it put that way, but that makes a lot of sense. Um, since we are a giant human oil spill.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what I think was really cool, you and I talked a little bit about before actually starting to record. Of course, Paul Stamets being sort of the face of all things mushroom out there these days, and seeing this clip where he was, I mean, it's brand new, talking about, of course, as you also referenced, um, microdosing, these small dose, more regular application of psilocybin or LSD or whatever it is you're microdosing is a pretty new methodology, and only in the last decade have people really started doing it in mass. So there's not a ton of data out there. So what the clip you and I were talking about, it was fascinating because Paul Stamets was referencing, yeah, a lot of the scientific community is kind of like, oh yeah, placebo or whatever, all the guys in Silicon Valley and all these entrepreneurs doing that. I don't think it's even enough to make a difference. Not really buying it, if you will. And now all of a sudden, he was saying just in the last few months, there's this new data showing that psilocybin, you know, well, first off, like these SSRIs and these different antidepressants, they're known to bind to TrkB receptors to produce the effect, the benefit, if you will. And brand new in recent months, research showing that psilocybin is 1,000 times more, a high dose of psilocybin, magic mushrooms is 1,000 times more effective at binding to these TrkB receptors. And so he was sort of making the case like, okay, so if it's a high dose, a full dose is 1,000 times more effective. What is a microdose? 100 times? Okay, even if it's 10 times and you don't have any of the negative benefits, and it's doing all this litany of other positive things to your mind, body, soul, spirit, all of it, like, wow, what a fascinating new piece of evidence in comparison that he said is having a lot of these people who are kind of poo-pooing it turning their heads and reassessing.
Well, and the TrkB receptor, it's technically spelled TRK-B. This is something that's just come on the scene the last few months, right? So it's still even fairly new in terms of understanding the mechanism of action, right? There's so much we don't know about the brain
Yeah.
still. And so up until this point in time, one of the core mechanisms of actions that we've looked at for psychedelics versus antidepressants is the serotonin receptors. So the 5-HT2A receptor, which is in the
Mm-hmm.
prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functioning. Psilocybin and LSD bind at the 5-HT2A receptor, which is partly responsible for their antidepressant effect, whereas antidepressants bind to the 5-HT1A receptor.
Mm.
So it's one receptor over, and that's responsible for the when something binds to the 5-HT1A, it more gets the dampening. sort of like you would with an SSRI, the numbing. But when something binds to the 5-HT2A, it's responsible for more of a catharsis, where there's that window of neuroplasticity open. Because what's also happening when you're microdosing and taking psychedelics is the fear response from the amygdala is downregulated. So you mentioned your dad has this sort of fear response and narrative, and a lot of people are scared of going into trauma or things that have happened in their past, because it can be sometimes a lot to handle and navigate. And so when we work with psychedelics, even at microdoses, what's happening is it's down regulating that fear response from the amygdala. Because of that down regulation of the fear response, people are noticing that taking psychedelics, even at microdoses, is also helping them to become more courageous. And that's, I think, another important part to emphasize is, when we feel more courageous, when we're more willing to make mistakes, when we're more willing to try things, even if it's not gonna, immediately help us to succeed. What, you asked this opening question about what's my passion. When we're more willing to have the courage to pursue our passion, then I think there's a lot of beautiful things that can happen in life. And so what we notice with a lot of people who are microdosing is, as they start microdosing, they start to have the courage to have that difficult conversation with a business partner or a romantic partner. They have the courage to quit their job that they know has always made them miserable, to pursue something that they are more in alignment with. They have the courage to go through potentially with quitting SSRIs, even though it's difficult and there's the withdrawal symptoms, because they know that there's a greater tomorrow that's beyond that horizon. So I think, we already mentioned the neuroplasticity, which is great, and how much more effective psychedelics are at this TrkB receptor than antidepressants. But I think something that often gets lost in the conversation is this sense of the importance of courage, knowing or doing what you have to do, even if it's going to be difficult or challenging. And again and again and again, and what we see with people who are working with psychedelics is they are willing to make the difficult decisions in the immediate term, because they know that in the long term it will benefit them and their life significantly.
It's and of course with the show we talk a lot about spirituality and the ultimate nature of reality and that kind of thing. So it's so wonderful to look at, like, sort of the 3D health physical benefits are just ever, it seems like, ever unfolding, like we were just talking about, like this is brand new realization, like but wait, there's more, and of course, the profound spiritual insights and awakenings that can happen for people. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time someone told me I did, psilocybin mushrooms and it changed my life. I mean, literally, I've heard that so many times over the decades from people. And so I'm curious, of course, being sort of a hub for all things psychedelic therapy, et cetera, with Third Wave, what, I love good stories around this stuff. Anything that is fun to share regarding, people's experiences or openings?
I have a few good stories that I'll share that are mine personally, around psychedelics that I think will have or touch a greater chord. So the first time I ever did LSD was May 2010, so about 13 years ago. And I had a beautiful, probably did 250 micrograms, outdoors, late spring, sunshine, beach, woods, water, beautiful and epic. And the experience was so epic that about a week after that, I was going on a trip to Tanzania in Africa with a school group that I was in for my biology degree. And at that time I had acid on these little tabs, the little paper tabs. So I just threw some in my camera case when I still had a digital cameras, when those were a thing, and brought it to Tanzania. And on two separate occasions, while on safari in Tanzania, I dropped acid, which was epic. And I mean, it was beautiful, enlightening, very opening. But what it sort of plugged me into was, as cliche as it sounds, this sort of circle of life notion that when you're on a psychedelic, especially something like acid, and you're literally, like, I was literally 15 feet away from 600-pound lions, in Ngorongoro Crater. There's wildebeest, there's hippos, there's cheetahs. And so you're actually able to see a full ecosystem play out in real time, right? So often, especially in the States, it's like we're not seeing mountain lions
Right.
and leopards, and we don't get to see these apex predators because they're so
Yeah.
rare these
Right.
days. But when you're in Africa and Tanzania, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I see how this full ecosystem is playing out with the sun and the grass and the wildebeest and the lions and the hyenas and scavengers. You see all of these sort of characters and roles as they're coming into real time. And so having that experience, really what it did is it facilitated this deep love and connection to
Yeah.
nature and the natural environment. And this is something, I mean, I'm sure many of your listeners resonate with this. Like, you know, if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that they fell in love with the
Yeah.
woods on a mushroom
Yep.
trip, right? I'd have a lot of
Yeah. Right.
nickels. And there seems to be a repeatable experience where when people are open to God, connection, source, the one, the ground of all being, our most tangible way of appreciating that is the natural
Yeah.
world, right? That in mainstream religion we get so abstracted from it. It's um, you know, it's this thing out there. It's this thing that we can't quite
Yep.
comprehend. But what indigenous cultures have known since the beginning of time is how alive the plants are, how alive nature is, how alive a rock
Yeah.
is, right? And so when we work with psychedelics, what I find to be true is everything starts to come alive around me. And I feel like that connection is really beautiful. So that's one aspect I think of like a beautiful experience. The other one is more interesting, which your listeners may appreciate. So ketamine's an interesting substance,
Indeed.
and you've probably worked with ketamine. It's more of a disassociative than the classic psychedelic, but it's legal.
I've used it.
It's
Yeah. I've
legally
worked with that one a
available,
lot.
and so it's legally available. You can go and you can get a prescription from a medical professional, and there's a lot of clinics now these days. And a few years ago, I was fortunate enough to work with a world-class body
Mm.
worker up in Gualala, which is in NorCal, a few hours north of San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco. And he does these 6-hour sessions. No, I'm sorry, 2-hour sessions, or no, 3-hour sessions with bodywork, 3-hour sessions with bodywork. And his special sauce that he's been using since the 1980s is rectal ketamine.
Oh wow. Rectal,
And
huh?
so rectal ketamine, because when you insufflate it, right, when you snort it or when you even do an IVIM, you immediately go into ego dissolution.
Yeah.
You immediately leave your body, right? And so the intention is in doing it's like a goop. In doing it rectally, you stay grounded,
Mm-hmm.
you stay in your body, you stay present, and then because it's an anesthetic, the body worker, this guy, can go in and all of a sudden you get into fascia and tissue that otherwise would not be accessible because it's too painful.
Gotcha.
So, and there's so much trauma that we keep stored in our bodies.
Yeah.
There's so much emotional energy that is stuck in our hips and our
Yep.
arms and our chest and everything. And so having that experience with ketamine, all of a sudden I was able to let go of a bunch of stuff that was just unconscious. It was
Yeah.
not in my conscious mind.
Right.
It wasn't
Stored
things
deep
that
in
I
your
knew,
body.
but it was just deep in my body. And that, I think, it's a good balance to the normal. Like so much of psychedelics is talking about this transcendent mystical experience, right?
Sure.
And I think there's tremendous value in that. But what I've always found to be my personal sweet spot is transformation, not transcendence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, how are we working with psychedelics in a way that's tangible, that's transformative, that keeps us in the here and now in the 3D reality, while still doing the necessary work to change things around us. I think sometimes there's too much of an emphasis on just going into 5D, on transcending our problems, on even bypassing some of the issues that we have. Whereas I'm a big fan of have those peak experiences. Those are very insightful and they can teach a lot, and balance those with like, be here in 3D reality. Let's do the work that we need to do to build a better tomorrow. So, yeah, those acid, ketamine. I mean, I've done my fair share of ayahuasca with dietas, with the Shipibo as well. 5-MeO DMT has been great.
Mm-hmm.
LSD continues to be sort of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day. And a way that I think about it, even generally, Brandon, is like, how do we look at psychedelics as a skill? And again, this is something we teach a lot in our facilitator training program. It's like, the skill of psychedelics consists of working with high doses for mystical experiences,
Mm-hmm.
microdoses for ongoing growth and development, and then non-psychedelic modalities like meditation, yoga, breath work, cold plunge sauna as the everyday modality. And I
Mm.
think it's not that everyone has to become masterful at working with psychedelics, but those who want to become facilitators or coaches
Yeah.
or guides or shamans, they should really be masterful at working with these plant allies, because when we're starting to engage with these substances, we're really engaging in a process of symbiosis.
Yeah.
And so looking at these psychedelics, these plant medicines as allies that we're in relationship with, they can help to not only heal and transform ourselves, but when we start to work with, executive coaches are working with CEOs, health and relationship or health and wellness coaches, relationship coaches are working with them. I just see them as fantastic accelerants to get where we're going to go,
Yeah.
but to do that in a much more condensed period of time.
Yeah, that's exactly, it's funny because I don't know what episode this is, episode 2100 or something.
5,000.
Yeah, some 25 million. And going back, I think it's like episode 6 or something. My friend who facilitates AI journeys for like 30 years now or something.
Wow.
We talked all about, I had done ayahuasca with him recently as of that episode. That's going back to 2015. And I remember him really looking at it that way, having been, deep down this path. I mean, he's done it with like Sting and ayahuasca with like Sting and Robert Downey Jr. and like all, he's like old school and been there and holding it down for a long time. And he's he was saying how, yeah, that very thing. It's like there's many paths to, self-realization and awakening and healing trauma and many modalities, and maybe psychedelics aren't for everyone. Certainly there's a time and a place, and everyone's unique and different, so there's no one size fits all of anything. However, for the people who do venture into these realms, it's, the way he put it is like you could go and have 20 years of counseling and go from, he kind of put his hands together like this and like a flower opening over, 10 years, 20 years of work and therapy and what, or one night with ayahuasca and, you have that same sort of level of flowering, and it, it's more of the fast path, if you will. So,
Well, I love that metaphor because it is the lotus flower metaphor, right? The lotus flower is the symbol of enlightenment in Buddhism.
Yep.
And so there's a really great metaphor as that relates to psychedelics, where some folks will dive in the deep end right away and do 5-MeO DMT, or they'll drink ayahuasca. And for some folks that really works, but you've probably heard your fair share of stories as well, where for some folks it can be quite destabilizing.
Yep.
or quite difficult, right? And so the metaphor that I love, this lotus flower metaphor, is first let's till the soil, right? So let's do the shadow work, let's do the therapeutic work, let's heal the trauma. MDMA and ketamine are great substances to till the soil. Microdosing is a really good opener for a lot of folks as well. Then once we have really rich soil, then we plant that new seed of self through psilocybin or LSD, because they facilitate that process of death and rebirth, that ego dissolution.
Yeah.
So we plant that new seed of self, and then we water that seed. We give sunlight to that seed. Those are the integration practices. That's the meditation. That's breath work. That's microdosing. That's changes in our diet. And then as that new seed starts to grow, then something like ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT, San Pedro, when we work with these, sophisticated plant allies, that can really help the lotus flower to blossom and open up. And what I always tell folks is like you said, this is a path. It's not necessarily the path for everyone, but it is a path. It's a very intense path at times. And it's a patient path, right? The path to self-realization is a patient path that even when we work and we have that aha moment with psychedelics where the clouds part and we can see the sort of top of the mountain peak, many times we still have to turn that state into a trait, right? We still have to do the integration work to actually embody that sort of experience of gnosis. And so that, like, for me, I didn't do ayahuasca till 7 years or 8 years into my path.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do 5-MeO DMT till 10 or 11 years into that path. And so I think there's also a thing of let this unfold, right? Let this emerge, be
Mm-hmm.
patient with it, with an understanding that reaching this pinnacle of enlightenment, for some people it takes 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. It's usually not just a snap of your fingers and you're there.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that the reason, going back to like mushrooms showing up in distressed environments, I truly believe that the reason psychedelics are having this massive comeback is because we're at a point in time right now where the wisdom provided by these allies is so necessary to balance the sort of godlike technology that we have at our fingertips.
Yeah.
Right. And that because psychedelics work in such a condensed time period, right? There are people who are like, we maybe have 2 or 3 generations left at our current burn,
Yeah.
literally
Right.
current burn.
Yep.
And that psychedelics are a tool that could catalyze a massive shift in a condensed period of time to basically save us from ourselves. Because I think a lot of people would agree that the environment will be fine at the end of the day. It will recover.
Yeah.
It's much more resilient. We as a human species,
A little more fragile.
it's a whole nother question.
Yeah. Yeah. Mother Earth will make it. I don't know that child human will if we don't get it straight,
Exactly.
So with third wave, what you put together is so awesome to have, this educational, community driven platform and facilitating people who want to go deeper with the work. Can you speak, as we sort of start to wind down a little bit here, speak to the platform and people that are interested in learning more and what they can find there?
So when I started Third Wave in 2015 now, so we started this about the same time. When you started the podcast, I was just starting Third Wave. Again, another interesting parallel in our
we definitely have a lot of those
in our lives. So when I started Third Wave in 2015, I'm a student of history. I studied history in undergrad, and I looked at what went wrong in the 60s. And what went wrong in the 60s is when it went from clinic to culture outside of the confines of sort of a regulated environment. It went sideways very quickly because we didn't have the context, we didn't have the literacy, we didn't have really the education to hold that as a Western culture. Yeah. And so what I was really focused on is how do we not repeat the mistakes of the past, and how do we leverage technology and the internet to help do that. And so the core of Third Wave is education, providers, and community. That first of all, people need to know and understand objectively the benefits and the risks of working with psychedelics. That once they know and understand the benefits and risks, they need to find a great provider, a clinic or a coach or a therapist or a retreat center to work with. And so we have a directory of providers on Third Wave as well. And then once they go through this experience, they often need to find the others, right? They have to look at who else can I talk with about this. And so we also have a community that's a Third Wave app. It's called Third Wave's Community. It's on the App Store on Apple and Android, and you can download that app. It's totally free and connect with people from all over the world who are also walking this path. So for any listeners who are just generally interested in psychedelics, I would recommend go to the Third Wave, sign up for our newsletter, check out the podcast, the Psychedelic podcast, and download the app and start to connect and engage with other people who are on this path as well. And then if there are any like coaches or facilitators or therapists or people who want to like actually, they've been down this path already and they want to support others to go down this path, I would recommend checking out. We have a 10-month training program that includes a 6-day intensive in Costa Rica, and that's at the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. So that's psychedeliccoaching.institute. That's a 10-month program to help you master the skill of psychedelics so you can help guide others through a process of healing and transformation. And then if folks just want to reach out to me personally, if they have questions or just want to, connect. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Paul Austin 3W. So the thirdwave.co, psychedeliccoaching.institute, and then on social, I'm Paul Austin 3W.
Cool. Yeah, very, very smart approach.
Thanks, bro.
Yeah, I mean, and it's people like you and Rick Doblin and Maps and people who are really like doing it, taking those paths of like, hey, this isn't for crazy hippies. This is like
Right.
for humans, the betterment of humanity, and let me show you how, and present it in a way that's intelligent and digestible, and etc. So I applaud the work that you're doing. Yeah, and yeah, it's just very inspiring. So I'd like to ask, one other thing regarding story. You've given us a little bit of psychedelic story time. I always love, one of the go-tos on the show is stories of synchronicity or serendipity or a positive paranormal story. So I'm curious if you have anything like that fun up your sleeve to share.
Oh, yeah. So the most relevant one to this conversation is the sort of origin of third wave in and of itself.
Cool.
That I was living in Budapest in 2015 as a digital nomad, and had just arrived for the summer, and a couple friends came to visit, and we did a reasonably high dose of LSD, again about 300 micrograms, in the hills outside of Budapest. And we just started to talk about psychedelics and sort of the resurgence of psychedelics. And then while not on that same trip, we were going to a lot of third wave coffee places, right? So third wave coffee, it's like Stumptown or Intelligentsia or Blue Bottle or these really nice boutique coffee spots where you get the swan on your artwork. So we were going to these coffee places, we were taking acid, and we were just talking about like, where is this going? How do we even define what this is? And so as we were talking about that in conversation, it just sort of like arose like, this is, we're really talking about the third wave of psychedelics. And there was no rational explanation for it. I think it just sort of came about because we were talking about third wave coffee and we were doing acid. And then all of a sudden this sort of thing came in where it's like, no, like, look at how these two actually sort of combine. And so I went back to my apartment later that night and I was like thinking about, okay, I love the name, but how do I actually explain this? How does this make sense? And that's when I then thought about, okay, the first wave is indigenous and ancient use. The second wave is the counterculture. And the third wave is now the sort of middle way between ancient ceremonial ritualistic use and scientific sort of cutting edge. So I think that's always the first thing that comes to mind is whenever it comes to creativity and sort of synchronicity, especially whenever I work with psychedelics, I just notice that synchronicities abound when working with psychedelics, and they just tap me into something way greater than I can explain. And
it definitely
there's just things that come through that are, there's no rational explanation for them, but they're always beautiful.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's I love that you are using psychedelics and organically, like, it sort of flowed up what it is that, of course, then became such a big part of your path, right? Exactly. It's a great example of like getting into that flow open state and just seeing where it leads. Exactly.
Well, thanks for having me on the show today, Brandon. It was fun to flip the mic, and I'm just grateful for you creating such a massive platform for these types of conversations. It was a ton of fun.
It definitely was. And I do have one final question for you.
Okay.
And it is this: in 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Paul Austin?
The meaning of life, I believe, is to steward the growth and emergence of beauty, of awe, of mystery. I think it's to remember our divinity as sovereign creators, and then to direct that power to serving others, to serving the earth, to serving our community, to serving our partnership, I really believe that the meaning of life is to be in service of something greater than ourselves that allows
Mm-hmm.
for the expression of the mystery of
Yeah,
existence.
I love that. Taking the baton and running with it as far and fast as you can. Yeah, I always think of Gandhi said, if you want to find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. And I always like to add to that. The reason I believe that holds true is because there are no others. And that's why it is, in giving that we receive. And, your path, whatever, I always say to people, if you don't know your path, I can give you one hint. It's going to involve service in some way, because that is, that's how it's structured, I believe. And so, yeah, thank you for the service that you do, and definitely a pleasure to connect with you again, and look forward to doing that in 3D sometimes. We'll have to do some psychedelics.
I'll make it up to the Mystic Manor
Yes,
sometime soon
for sure,
so
for
we can
sure.
kick it.
Well, with that being said, all of you out there, thank you for tuning your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts into another episode. Until next time, journey well. I love you so, 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 so much.